Jesus said, "That is why I tell you not to worry about your livelihood, what you are to eat or drink or use for clothing. Isn't life more than just food? Isn't the body more than just clothes? Look at the birds in the sky. They do not sow or reap. They gather nothing into barns, yet our God in heaven feeds them. Aren't you even more than they? Which of you by worrying can add a moment to your lifespan? And why be anxious about clothing? Learn a lesson from the way the wildflowers grow. They do not work, they do not spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in full splendor was arrayed like one of these. If God can clothe in such splendor the grasses of the field, which bloom today and are thrown on the fire tomorrow, won't God do so much more for you, you who have so little faith?" The Gospel of Christ. Please be seated. So, on this celebration of the life and work of St. Francis of Assisi, it occurred to me that it's really difficult for us to get a picture of a human being who lived, well, nearly 800 years ago. What tends to happen when we look back at historical figures, especially historical figures who've gained a large reputation amongst the common folk, is that we tend to make caricatures out of these people. And St. Francis has been turned into a caricature. And I'd like us to get past the kind of bird bath image of St. Francis, you know, the one who's, well, this particular shot of this particular bird bath comes from a Walmart advertisement. So that's how ubiquitous the bird bath icon has become. And I'd like us to move beyond the bird bath image to a fuller, less cartoonish understanding of St. Francis, partly because the caricature is rather safe. But the actual St. Francis is kind of a challenging character. And so rather than stick with the cartoonish caricature of St. Francis, I'd like us to look a little bit at his life to see if we can get beyond the cartoon, to see who this Giovanni, who he was baptized as, who this Giovanni was, who lived in Assisi nearly 800 years ago. And so one of the things that that comes across in any of the writing about St. Francis, and indeed in his own writings, is that he was a man of ambition, terrific ambition. He was born into a wealthy merchant class. His father ran a clothing business. He created clothing for the nobility. So he comes from a very wealthy family, but they were still considered commoners. They were not part of the nobility. And so Francis wanted nothing more, Giovanni wanted nothing more than to become part of the nobility. And he figured he had a pathway into the nobility, and that was by becoming a knight. And this is at the time of the Crusades, and he figured he'd go on and achieve some glory in battle, and then some noble person would receive him into the nobility, and he could move up in the ranks in that way. And so he has a really clear path in mind, and he becomes a knight. He goes off into battle, and his first battle is with a neighboring town about 20 miles away. He's immediately captured, and he's thrown into prison, and he spends about a year in prison until finally his father ransoms him out of prison. But even though he comes back sort of dejected and depressed, he still has this vision that he's going to go off and become a knight and gain glory on the battlefield and get into the noble classes. And so his father lavishes upon him a new set of armor, some new horses, and he goes back off into battle. And he goes quite a bit farther afield at this point, and the life as a soldier is not quite as he had imagined it, and he becomes dejected and depressed. And the story, which is legendary, is that he has a dream, and he's trying to decide what it is that he's supposed to do. And he hears the voice of Jesus saying to him, who is it better to serve, the master or the servant? You know, he's wrapped up in wanting glory, and he thinks the pathway to glory is through honor in battle. And he hears this voice, Jesus saying, who is it better to serve, the master or the servant? And of course, Giovanni answers, the master can give me more. The rich man is the one that I should be serving. And the voice of Jesus says, go back to Assisi, and there you will discover all that you are looking for. So Giovanni returns to Assisi, and he has this encounter that has become infamous right now. It's considered his conversion moment. He runs into a group of lepers, and he's not only afraid of lepers, he says he's repulsed by lepers. And he has an encounter with a particular leper, and he is so moved by this encounter that he actually not only goes near the leper, he kisses the leper. And it's at that moment that he has a vision of the Christ. He sees the Christ in the leper. And so this begins a turning in him. And so he's trying to find another purpose for his life other than seeking glory and gaining entry into the nobility. And he spends a great deal of time in contemplation in the hills and caves in and around Assisi. He spends a lot of time in prayer, and it's a long story to talk about his conversion, but I want to highlight one particular thing that he's searching for, and that is he's searching for a kind of peace. And he thinks that the road of contemplation and unity with nature is the way to achieve peace. And one day he goes down into a small church on the outside of the city walls. It's called Saint Daminos. And he goes into this small church, which is kind of run down and falling down. This is a shot of it today and what it looks like today. He goes in there and he's praying, and he has a kind of vision. He's praying to the cross, which is dirty and the whole place is shabby, and he has a vision of Jesus once again speaking to him. And the word that comes through to him, which is what I want to focus on today, is rebuild my church, which as you see is falling down. And so Francis decides that this is the purpose of his life. He needs to rebuild this small church. And so he gathers together some friends, and they rebuild the small church. And then Francis begins to realize that that's not exactly what the vision had in mind, that he needs to rebuild the entire church, which is falling down around them. And what Francis comes to is an understanding that what is necessary is not the grandeur and the riches and the jewels and the gold, but rather putting the gospel at the center of the church. This is how the church is to be rebuilt. And one of the things that has always stymied me in my study of Francis, it's always sort of prevented me from getting any farther, is his emphasis on poverty, because the Franciscans become the first mendicant order. They are actually, they have trouble becoming an order because they are beggars. They go around begging. They take nothing with them, and they live a life of poverty. And so as a wealthy, Westerner, the idea of adopting poverty is not something that I'm ready to sign up for. Anybody here want to sign up for poverty? Seriously? No takers for poverty? That's where I always get stymied with St. Francis. It's like, oh yeah, his stuff about the birds and being one with nature, all that stuff I love it. It's wonderful, it's beautiful. But a life of poverty. And so this week I was reading from St. Bonaventure and a few other Roman Catholic sources about what it was that Francis means by the idea of living a life of poverty. And for me, it's kind of opened up some new areas of discovery. For Francis, poverty was about putting the gospel at the very center of everything in your life. And for Francis, the gospel is love, which makes sense when you consider his conversion experience with the leper, right? The act of loving, that which repulses you, that to which you are not naturally drawn. So this overwhelming sense that this is what the gospel is about. It's about love. And this desire to put love at the center of it. And he sees poverty as the way to put love at the center of everything, including the church. But what he means by poverty is not going without. That's not what he's talking about. So he's not talking about not going without, but rather asking the question, am I loving with what I have? This is what Francis means by a life of poverty. You don't own anything, but everything that you have control over, are you loving with it? For Francis, that's what it means to put the gospel at the center of everything in your life, is to recognize that the gospel is love. They are one and the same. And so the question becomes for everybody, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? And how do you put the gospel at the center of everything? And it occurred to me that as a community, we're asking those kinds of questions about our church. You know, rebuild my church. As you can see, it's falling down. And how do we put the gospel at the heart of who we are as a community? Now, most of us think that as a small church that we're impoverished already, and so we're not signing up for any more poverty as a community. But if we take Francis' teaching to heart and we ask ourselves the question, with everything that we have as a community, are we loving with what we have? That's the question that Francis asks. And that's the question around which he builds his life and his communities. What would it mean for us as a church to ask that question before every decision? Are we loving with everything we have? What would that mean for us as individuals to put the gospel at the center of everything? Everything that we have, our homes, our wealth, our health, our talents, our time, our energy. What would it mean for us to put the gospel at the center of everything and ask ourselves, are we loving with everything that we have? Putting the gospel at the center of everything means that love is at the center of everything, and that question becomes our path. The way in which we follow the Christ is by asking, am I simply loving that which attracts me? Or am I actually loving even those things that repulse me? Even those things to which I am not drawn? Am I loving with what I have? This is the question for us as individuals and as a community. And so on this St. Francis Sunday, may we learn to put the gospel at the center of everything. May we learn to put love at the center of everything. And may we learn to love with everything that we have. Amen.